It's a real pleasure to be speaking with Dr. Adam Gledhill, who's the course director for sport, exercise, and health science at Leeds Beckett University. He has a wealth of experience working with athletes, teaching university students, and he's done a substantial amount of research on different topics, including the psychological aspects of sport injury. Thanks, Adam, for taking the time to speak. It's great to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. Nice to be here.
If you could talk a little bit about what your background is and I guess what got you interested in sport psychology, that would be great.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of my academic background, I've got my bachelor's and my master's degree both in sport and exercise science, with a more of a focus on sport and exercise psychology. And then my PhD was actually around the broad area of psychosocial factors that are associated with talent development in female youth football. Now, I guess as part of the process of completing that PhD, one of the things that, and my applied background working within women's and girls football as well, has very much been around the impact that injury can have on both the individual and the career development of female football players. So I guess in terms of my academic and my applied interest into the area of psychology of sports injury, it really came about from those areas. I guess my personal interest in it, like many of us, has come from being a young athlete who was, quite physically mature for his age and ended up playing lots and lots of sport in lots of different sports, and picking up a significant number of injuries in football and basketball and track and field and rugby and those sorts of things. And and I guess reflecting on a lot of those experiences as a young athlete, and part of my motivation for working within this area is recognizing a lot of those challenges, both from personal experience and from the experience of, as you mentioned, working with a number of different individuals and teams over the past probably 15, 18 years or so now. Is really about how can we work with athletes most broadly to, help to not create a divide between performance and health, but actually realize that performance and health are quite natural bedfellows, and rather than treating them as two distinct things, just recognizing that actually, really, if we're going to get the best out of athletes that we work with, that performance and health are actually inextricably linked. Yeah. A real important health consideration for us with athletes is the number of injuries, A, that happen, and then B, how long they last for. Yeah. So yeah, I guess as a 2-minute summary, that's probably how we've got to where we are today. Yeah. I guess for me, one of the nicest things has been probably over the past 5 or 10 years, now having much more opportunity to work with sports medicine practitioners, those sorts of things, who historically might not necessarily have had as much of an interest in the psychology of sports injury, whereas now it's becoming much more central to their practice and becoming much more interested in those things.
Yeah. So you touch on a number of things, Adam, that I want to pick up on, but you mentioned your doctoral research was in the area of talent development in female football. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about your work in that area, or the focus of it.
So yeah, in terms of the broad program of research, we really wanted to understand a lot more about the different factors that might influence a female athlete's progression, specifically within their football career. So we started having a look initially, doing some work with talented female youth football players, so players who were representatives at professional women's football clubs in the UK as part of the Football Association's kind of girls talent pathway over in the UK, and we started monitoring those over a period of just under 2 years to look at the different factors that really influence their career progression. And a lot of the things that came out of that were particularly important. Family influences around the roles of parents and siblings, and starting to have a look more about and understand more about things like the roles of self-regulation and goal-directed behaviours, and how they influence career progression. But the next kind of part of that program of research was looking at players who perhaps didn't make it, despite being part of those types of programs, and starting to understand more about their journeys and their experiences as young athletes. And a lot of things there around, kind of volitional behaviours and some of the choices that players made, but also for some of the players, elements around their injury history and the severity of their injuries, and also then in many respects, some of the resources that are available to help and support them through some of those journeys, along with lots of other things around dual career demands and some of the things that are quite, I guess, in some ways quite unique to female football players and their careers.
Yeah.
So, and then moving on from there, we moved away from the individual athletes and started looking at more of the environmental concerns and considerations, and starting to understand more about athletes' perceptions of the environments that they were in as young female football players in the UK. So looking at their perceptions of their academies or their development squads, those sorts of things. And there are lots of elements around perhaps a need for greater degree of communication between key stakeholders or key social agents within the young athlete's career. So between coaches and school teachers, coaches and parents, those sorts of things, and understanding how we can develop some of those areas to really produce a higher quality of support network for young athletes that were going through that development pathway. And I guess one of the nice things for me is over the past 10 years or so has been to see how those types of pathways for young female players, particularly in the UK, have developed quite significantly now.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like your research was multifaceted in that you were looking at a number of factors that could influence the pathway or trajectory of whether athletes make it to a particular level, or I don't know if you were looking at them, like when you said they didn't make it, does that mean that they dropped out at a certain level, or maybe you can clarify that.
So in terms of the players that kind of didn't make it, we interviewed players who have been part of kind of the girls' talent pathway over in the UK, which is a pathway that's designed to, as the name suggests, to help young female players progress through from grassroots football into the more regional regional centres of excellence, regional talent clubs, into academy levels, and then hopefully through into professional clubs, and into the progressing through the age group and into senior international teams. So there's a very well designed pathway that's in place for that. And we interviewed players that had been part of that pathway, but then hadn't progressed all the way through to to kind of senior professional level, or had dropped out of football altogether and then maybe re-entered at a lower level, those sorts of things. And lots of interesting things within that come out, let's say, around things like some of the dual career demands, and almost getting to a point where they're feeling like they're having to make a choice between football and education because the two just aren't marrying up very well with each other.
Yeah.
Through to some of the influences of quite important people within that network, teachers and parents, who at the time still didn't necessarily understand what a professional career was within women's football, or even there being such a thing as an opportunity for a professional career in women's football.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, we're almost, at times unintentionally and maybe inadvertently, almost counselling the young girls away from football, because a career or a life away from football was seen as a more viable option. So lots of different things that can kind of fit into that kind of progression picture. But as we said, one of the things that was interesting for me for a lot of the players that we interviewed at different times was some of their injury experiences, and some of the more potentially more negative injury experiences as well, and how that had impacted on on their career choices and their career progression, which, as you know, as you alluded to earlier on, has almost created not necessarily a sidestep, but what I would view as probably a very complementary program of research now, looking more broadly at psychology of sports injury, and some of that work specifically focusing on female football players and some of the factors that might influence things like their retirement decisions, or the quality of their return to sport outcomes for those that do return to sport post-injury, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so on that note, Adam, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, it sounds like injury can play a prominent role in the pathway of an athlete. Maybe you can speak to the role of injury or its impact, I guess, in mitigating or reducing the likelihood that female soccer players, for instance, continue to move upward, I guess, in that trajectory, or move to higher levels.
Yeah, and I guess one thing that is, obviously is important to note now is that things have improved significantly over the past 10, 15 years, particularly around the professionalisation of women's football in the UK. The support for women and girl athletes that play football is now much more substantial and robust than it used to be. Kind of criteria that people need to be able to achieve to have licenses to run different types of organisations, and staffing levels and things like that have improved significantly in recent years. And I think that hopefully that's gonna then transfer through to reducing, I guess, a lot of the modifiable injury risk factors. But when it comes to some of the more severe injuries and things that we know are a challenge, particularly for women athletes, things like ACL ruptures that are surgically repaired, that are real severe, and that we know that there's a fairly significant risk of them happening again and then again once they've happened already.
Yeah.
So those sorts of things, they tend, the more severe injuries and the recurrent injuries, from what we've seen through the program of research so far, tend to be the ones that start making people think about whether or not returning to sport or retiring from football is the right thing for them, or even leaving a certain level and returning at a lower level and carrying on playing more recreationally. And I think some of the more interesting things that we've found from that have been around where people have made retirement decisions even when the severity of the injury hasn't necessitated it, and have been making those decisions around for reasons, not necessarily because they're scared of getting injured again or worried overly about getting injured again. They accept that is in many ways part of being a football player and part of being a female football player particularly. Mm-hmm. But more this idea of the anticipation or the expectation of the injuries happening again, and that kind of then creating the question of, do I want to go through this again and then again and again for something that, if I'm in a university degree alongside playing football, or if I'm in a full-time job alongside playing football, or if I'm in a part-time job alongside playing football, all those things that mean that I'm taking time away from the other stuff that I have to do.
Yeah.
To try to then focus on rehab. So some of those things have been quite interesting and quite novel, I think, that are potentially quite unique to this type of group.
Yeah. So is it the case that, you mentioned severe injuries or maybe repetitive injuries? Is it the case that those kinds of injuries are more likely to induce questions about the athlete's priorities? Because you mentioned, like their work or other considerations, whereas maybe less severe injuries don't necessarily promote that kind of reflection, or yeah.
I mean, I think they certainly promote it to a greater degree. I'd say particularly the severe ones and recurrent injuries, where the light at the end of the tunnel almost starts becoming dimmer and dimmer, because, like I said, there's just this expectation that the injury is going to happen again. Mm-hmm. In terms of promoting the kind of reflection and the questions around things like dual career demands or competing demands in other areas, naturally more severe the experience for us, the more we're going to start asking questions of how that's impacting on other important areas of our life. And I think that we have probably a really important responsibility when we're working with athletes in that way, to start looking at how we can educate the athlete, work with our athletes to educate them about the injuries, educate them about some of the implications of return to sport, any of those, kind of those associated risks and benefits. But for me, it's very much always about working with athletes in such a way that places them at the center of the decision-making process, and really helping them to feel like they're able to make really well informed decisions about their future careers, and doing that from a position of strength, as opposed to it almost being made from a position of panic and a little bit of not necessarily a position of hearsay, but not necessarily being as evidence informed as it could be.
Right. And so I was going to ask, why is it important to provide education to the injured athlete?
I mean, I guess really around some of the things that I've just been saying. If we aren't working with our athletes to develop their understanding of the injury, any risks and benefits that are associated with return to sport, things around timescales, things like criterion for progression during the injury, those sorts of things. How can we expect our athletes to be really in control of their injury rehabilitation experience? How can we expect them to adhere, as in to volitionally and actively take part in the different rehabilitation activities that that they're going to be needing to do in order to be able to progress effectively? And I think when we always need to recognize that an injury experience will be something that's very subjective, it's very individual, but there will be different things that, for the majority of injured athletes, severely injured athletes that have got recurrent injuries, there'll be common things that will be themes throughout those. So working with the athletes so that they can really take more control over the decisions that they want to make, so that they feel more able to make those types of decisions about return to sport, rather than it just being, I guess colloquially, coach says they need me back in 3 months, so I'm going to be back in 3 months, or doctor says it's probably not safe and I should probably just retire, so I'm going to retire. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's really important that we're able to help to educate the athletes to such a degree that they understand everything that's being said, why it's being said, and what options that creates for them, so that they can then start thinking about which ones are best suited for them. But I mean, for me, ultimately, in the majority of situations, the athlete should be the person who makes the final decision about return to sport.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned this issue of control, and I guess if the athlete is to be at the center of the rehabilitation, given that it's, the injury has happened to them and it's their bodies and their sport experience, that education is really important in fostering perceptions of control. And I know in the research that you've done, that others have done, that I've been fortunate to do with others, that issue of control continues to arise, right? And it's not a big surprise that if you're an athlete who's used to having a sense of control over your schedule, your training, your body's ability to do certain things at the drop of a hat, and then you get injured, maybe that sense of control is very much, out the window, right? Or kind of
absolutely
thrown into question. So sort of
and
reinforcing it is important, right?
very much so. And a lot of the elements around rationalizing the activities that athletes will intuitively need to engage with in order to increase their chances of a successful return to sport. Things like adopting a really sort of open and collaborative approach to communication with the athletes, where we're inviting questions, we're creating experiences that they can learn from, and we're almost creating that psychologically safe environment for athletes, where it's very open, it's very honest. We develop those kind of trusting relationships, and I guess all of those things will help to contribute to the degree of control that an athlete feels over their experience. You know, their kind of perceptions of social support, all those sorts of things, which we know are at least associated with more successful return to sport outcomes.
Right. So I want to pick up on that point more. There's a lot of factors, I'm sure, that go into a successful, as you mentioned, return to sport.
Yeah.
Based on your substantial research and work with injured athletes or with practitioners, what are some of the key factors, if you could identify them, in terms of successful return, or maybe factors that differentiate, in terms of going back to our earlier discussion, the pathway that people take, those who return maybe versus those who kind of drop out, or
Yeah, and I think there's some fairly common themes, I guess, that you would probably say are evident in the research, but are also probably pretty evident as well in terms of working with athletes that have been through that journey. I guess the first thing would be trying to figure out how we actually define a successful return to sport, because that will mean different things to different people. To a medical practitioner, that might be that the athlete just doesn't get injured again, or doesn't get that same injury again. To a coach, it might be that they're able, or to an athlete, it might be that they're able to go back really quickly and make some sort of contribution when they're needed. To the family around the athlete, it might be that they're just generally well and they're not suffering through it. And if they get past that point, then so I think understanding what successful return to sport means is an important part of that. But I think for would all be in agreement that for the majority of athletes, that will be, I can get back to at least my pre-injury levels of performance and remain as much as possible injury free again moving forwards.
Yeah.
Now,
Go
on, sorry.
Oh no, sorry. Sorry for cutting you off, but I just, before I forget, I know you're going to probably talk more about specific factors, but I think that's such an important point, Adam, that you just mentioned, that, I guess implicit in my question is this idea that we know what a successful return is, right? Or that it's just assumed that successful return, as you were alluding to, you return to the same sport at a similar or higher level, whereas, you're suggesting that's not necessarily the case, that we should really question what that is, and it may differ from one athlete to the next, right? Like maybe it's just playing at a recreational level, if that's what the athlete wants, or maybe it's just, not getting hurt again, or it could mean a lot of things, I guess. And I just thought that was such a great point and a really important one. So sorry for cutting you off.
Yeah, no, it's fine. And I guess it depends in some ways how, I don't know if philosophical is the right word or not, but I guess, yeah, it's the one that I'll use. I guess it depends how philosophical you want to get about return to sport. That, the pragmatics of performance sport are that people will get injured at times, and people might at times need to go back slightly before would be ideal, and those sorts of things. And there's all sorts of, kind of risk modifiers that play a role in that. But we could also kind of question, is it really a successful return to sport if that return to sport has meant that somebody's got a degenerative health condition that's going to affect them for the rest of their life, and they might experience other mental health or elements of poor mental health as a result of that. In the short term, we could probably say it's a successful return to sport, but in the long term, is it? That's I guess that's very much a philosophical debate that will challenge that health performance element that I spoke about earlier on. And so you're right. I think it is a really important question. But if we do stick with what would be the ideal for people, i.e., they return to at least pre-injury levels of performance in the same sport and remain injury-free, which, for the majority of athletes, that's what it would be. A lot of the elements around confidence in the injured area, confidence in their ability to return to pre-injury levels of performance are key. We know that lower levels of worry and lower levels of fear tend to be more associated with successful return to sport. perceptions of both availability and quality of social support seem to be important. So we did some, again, interesting, we did some research that we will hopefully be sharing relatively soon around the some important factors around people who made more of a successful return to sport were higher perceptions of higher quality informational support, but also, interestingly, along with that, a slightly longer return to sport time. And that then creates some questions around, well, if people have got higher quality informational support, do they then understand the situation a little bit better regarding their injury and regarding some of the risks and benefits? And as a result of that, are they more comfortable to take that extra little bit of time that's needed to make the return so that they don't get injured again?
Yeah.
So some interesting elements around that. But I think some of the one of the other, I guess, interesting findings that's come out of some recent work that we've done with athletes who have met that what we would call a successful return to sport, i.e. return to pre-injury levels and didn't get injured again. Around this expectation that the injury rehab process isn't smooth, and there'll be days where you're just not on it and you just don't want to do it, and accepting that that's just a natural part of the injury process. And you know, and as entering into some interesting conversations around nobody's 10 out of 10 all the time. But if you're turning up and you're kind of 2 out of 10, then really, as long as you get the 2 out of 2 out of yourself and accept that that's the best that you can do on that day,
Yeah.
then that's a really healthy way of approaching that rehab, rather than trying to push too hard, too fast, too soon.
Yeah.
So some interesting things around those that you know are well documented in the literature, but are also really evident in the real world practice as well.
Yeah, yeah, those are some great points. You know, in terms of the importance of informational support, getting that knowledge again or understanding. You mentioned education earlier, and then what is it about that information or knowledge that then translates into the more successful return, which, as you define, for many athletes may be return to pre-injury levels without getting re-injured. I thought it was also interesting you mentioned that, you know, longer rehabilitations, there's some evidence suggesting that that may also be beneficial in terms of the long-term prospect of success. I came across a study recently that was looking at ACL reoccurrence in youth athletes, and they found that athletes who waited actually up to 2 years were significantly less likely to re-tear their ACL than those who went back prior to 2 years. And they said, you know, the common suggestion nowadays or in recent years has been 9 to 12 month time frame for the return. Well, this is suggesting that maybe taking twice as long as that is actually beneficial in terms of the goal of reducing re-injury occurrence. And so I thought that's also, you know, a really interesting point about the length of time, and I wonder if that goes into other things like, you know, you mentioned a sense of control where, you know, if the athlete is kind of being pressured to return or they feel like they have to rush, maybe that undermines their sense of control. Whereas if they feel like, okay, I can take the time that I need, even if it's longer, that also results or maybe seems to be associated with, I should say, more successful return. And the other thing, these are just reflections here, Adam, more than a question, but you've jogged a lot of interesting thoughts here and made some wonderful points. Your point about expectations is certainly similar to some findings that I've found in some work with injured athletes. In one study, you may know Ross Wadey, a British colleague, and I did some exploratory work, I guess, surrounding that idea of what it means to be psychologically ready. And that point about expectations also came up. And, you know, athletes said that part of being ready was having realistic expectations, and that wasn't always easy, or that may be contrary to their mindset that you alluded to of more, you know, doing more and faster and getting back quicker. But, you know, this notion that expectations may play an important role. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk more about the role of athlete expectations and the impact that, like, what are some common expectations for recovery? What impact do they have on the rehabilitation?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the, I guess expectation management is an important part of it, and some of the elements around helping athletes to understand that when they return immediately, they might not necessarily have that, the same level of performance in there, and helping people to understand some of the timescales that are associated with when they might be able to expect that type of performance can be quite helpful on a number of levels. If athletes think that I'm physically ready to return to sport now because I've played some training games and things like that, equates to I'm back now at pre-injury levels of performance. We'll go back in its first game back and we can't play like that because we're a bit more tired, we're maybe not necessarily as technically and tactically aware at game speed as we would be, those sorts of things. Huge source of frustration for people when that starts happening, if they don't necessarily expect that that might be the case. Now, again, we've got to kind of balance our ideal with some of the pragmatics of the real world of high performance sport. When people are going back after an injury, there will be an expectation that they can perform to a level. So helping people to understand those levels, how they can achieve those levels, what they might need to do to be able to just take care of themselves to be able to maintain those levels. They're all important elements around preventing some of the potentially some of the threats to athletic identity that can come along with not being able to perform at the level that's expected, i.e., not be the athlete that they were. Yeah. Some of the impacts of, let's say, things like frustration, some of the preventing some of the reductions in both performance and injury-related confidence, because we know that for a lot of athletes, if they're not performing well after they go back from being injured, for a lot of people, in some way that's attached to the injury as well. Am I not performing as well as I could do before because of what's happened with my injury?
Right.
And I guess I started off talking a lot about athlete education and relationships with athletes and social support and those sorts of things at the start of this conversation, because ultimately all of those things, that the foundations of the athlete's injury experiences, and the more that we can prepare the athlete through the injury journey, the more they're going to be able to know what to expect, reflect on different things that are happening, maybe expect that there might be some setbacks along the way, particularly when you're increasing things like training load or technical and tactical load, those sorts of things. So I guess, excuse me, being able to prepare the athlete around those elements is one of the ways that we can almost protect against some of those, let's say, some of those potentially over-adventurous expectations when people go back to sport, which then ultimately can then be the foundations of some of the more negative psychological consequences for athletes after their return to sport.
Yeah.
But so I guess, go on, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just saying, I guess that gives rise to another recommendation, which is the importance of almost monitoring athletes post return to sport as well, because we are starting to see, I'd say probably an incremental evidence base, both from an anecdotal perspective and from kind of more empirical or case-based research in some instances around that some of the more negative responses to return to sport for athletes don't necessarily happen straight away. They can happen 3 months or 6 months down the line. So, making sure that we're paying attention to that in the same way as we're paying attention to the athlete's load, monitoring the physiological responses to return to sport, those sorts of things can be an important element of our athlete care post-return to sport as well.
Yeah. And so it sounds like managing that the expectations, or moderating the expectations, and as you're suggesting, a lot of what goes into that is about communicating about what may be realistic, or the fact that, okay, just because you've competed in a few training sessions doesn't necessarily mean that if you go back into a match situation, you're going to be as technically proficient, or you're going to be able to do things at, high speed, or, your awareness in competitive situations may take time to develop. That having that communication, those conversations, is really important in managing expectations. And that by doing that, it also sounds like there's benefits then for maybe the athletes' cognitive or emotional functioning, that when they have expectations that are realistic and informed by science, by qualified practitioners, that then reduces the likelihood that they're going to be frustrated because they're not getting, back in and sort of picking up where they left off. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we through that part of it, we've spoken a lot about almost what we can do for the athlete, and then what we and the athlete can do together. But let's not lose sight of what some of the things that particularly more experienced athletes can bring to the table as well.
Yeah.
They know their bodies, their minds, and their capabilities better than we do. So trust that experience of the injured athletes, that they can share information with us that's going to be relevant for that's going to be relevant for informing some of the work that we will do both during and before and after return to sport.
Yeah.
And really making sure that we spend the time to get to know our athletes as well as part of that, so that we, in getting to know our athletes, we will start to get to know more about what are their normative behaviours, for example, and by definition then what is different from the norm from them. And we might start to pick up on little behavioural things. Are they not necessarily going into a challenge full tilt like they would have done before? Or are they not necessarily giving everything on that sprint in a one-on-one duel for a ball? Or are they, maybe pulling out of going up for a header or going in for a tackle? They're all little behavioural things that we can see where that might be an indicator that an athlete isn't necessarily ready to return to full performance as yet.
Yeah. So, I was going to talk about or ask you that question about how do you know when an athlete is actually ready to get back into more competitive training or high levels of play. And I think you mentioned a really important point there, that some of it may be observational, right? It's not, I guess probably, as we know, there's some questionnaires, surveys that ask athletes about how psychologically ready they are, but you're also suggesting the importance that there are behavioral cues that an observer could pick up on. And, I think you mentioned some great examples. Is the athlete hesitant going in, for a header, or like how tenacious are they when they're going in for a tackle, or, certain things that might indicate some hesitancy and therefore a lack of readiness. Is that an accurate summary of your?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess your original question of how do we know if an athlete's ready, that's kind of the $1 billion question, isn't it? Literally, in some cases. And some of the things that I just spoke about are ways that we've informed return to sport decisions with athletes, but very much a multidisciplinary approach in terms of involving the athlete, coaching staff, kind of sports science staff, sports medicine staff. Within the sports science stuff, I include kind of sports psychology stuff within there. I've mentioned about the importance of getting to know your athlete and understanding their behaviours, so that you can see differences from the norm and start to pick up if there's any differences within those that might be indicators. The use of some of the established questionnaires within there that are available, although granted, like many self-report measures, there are a number of potential issues that come with that, not least of which, if an athlete knows that it's part of the return to sport decision, we are very much trusting their integrity to not just give socially desirable answers. But things like the IPRRS, the psychological readiness to return to sport, the re-injury anxiety inventory, ACL RSI, those sorts of things, they're all kind of helpful helpful questionnaires that can be used in different circumstances
Right.
to support that decision.
I want to pick up on that a little bit, Adam. So you mentioned that athletes, particularly if they're aware that decisions or judgments may be made based on their responses to these questionnaires. So, for instance, this IPPRS, or the Injury Psychological Readiness questionnaire, asks athletes about how confident they are to return. So I'm wondering, from your standpoint, do you think we can really get reliable or valid information from an athlete who maybe they're so intent on returning to sport, or like they really desperately want to get back, and as a practitioner someone gives them this questionnaire to fill out? What's your sense of the value of engaging in that exercise?
Yeah, I guess the idealist in me would say that if we've got really strong, robust relationships with people, and we know that our athletes are able to act with integrity and be honest and truthful, knowing that it's in their best interest that they do that, then yeah, it's a great exercise. However, we can at times be working with athletes where then to all intents and purposes might not necessarily even be able to think that rationally at that point, because of the lots of different things that they've got going on. They might feel like if it's particularly in the run up to an important event, last game of the season, cup final, cup semi-final, playoff, all those sorts of things, that modifies their perception of risk. If we've then got potential financial implications for them, do I get a contract or not, depending on whether I play that next game, then the way that some questionnaires are worded, it's very easy for an athlete to say, well, if I circle that box, that says I'm more confident, or I'm less worried, or I'm not as scared.
Yeah.
And people will think that that's a good thing. So yeah, but I think I think there's that risk with probably a contentious point, but I think there's that risk with lots of different types of return to sport measures that we'll use, not necessarily just self-report psychological questionnaires. And we can look at it the other way. If an athlete is doing a physical fitness test that they know is going to be part of their return to sport decision, and if we flip it and it's for a game that they don't necessarily want to play in, then or it's an event that they don't necessarily want to compete in,
yeah,
it's really easy to look a little bit slower or a little bit less powerful if we want to as well. So yeah. I guess the question isn't, I don't think it's a question that's necessarily limited just to, kind of different psychological inventories that we'd use. Although I do accept that, given that in many ways that's probably more of a novel aspect and something that people are less familiar with. It is a criticism that is available out there in the literature as well about the use of self-report measures. It's going to be something that we need to consider. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, if I've just given lots of food for consideration there.
No, I think perfectly. I mean, as you're suggesting, I think, or alluding to, that it's complicated, right? You said it's sort of readiness. When is an athlete ready is kind of the $1 million question. And as with most things, there's a lot that goes into it, right? So it's, it's probably a product of a lot of things that happened over the course of rehabilitation, as you mentioned, and the athlete's motivation, and of course they could be motivated to indicate a higher level of confidence than might actually be the case, or as you mentioned, whether it's a physical or psychological test, they could be motivated to underperform or to sandbag, so to speak, because they don't necessarily want to return. So, or there could be a lot of kind of social and cultural dynamics that influence, their performance. I mean, I guess as a thought to the question that I asked, I would also say, well, I suppose it's one, like these psychological inventories, or maybe one piece of information that can be used to inform. And you mentioned this idea of a multidisciplinary kind of framework, where maybe there are some physical tests, there are some psychological tests, but I also think, part of the value of a psychological test may be how it's framed. And you kind of said that point, I think, earlier, is that, if the athlete is told, listen, this is confidential, it's not the entire decision to return is not being based strictly on your answers to this question, or if it's framed like, this is really just to inform discussion between you and me, right? Or, so some of it, I guess, is it not just in the questionnaire itself, but in the delivery of it, or the information that's conveyed surrounding its provision to the athlete.
I think we always need to really keep in mind a lot of the common factors around how we work with athletes. And if we go back to basics with it, we know that a lot of the success of the work, if you want, in inverted commas, success of the work that we do will be largely determined by a strong perception of a working alliance, a real strong perception of shared goal commitment, and taking the time to develop really strong relationships with people, because we know that that's the foundation of the trust between athlete and athlete support personnel. Yeah. And I think if we're going to, when we're working with injured athletes at a time where, as I said, they might struggle to just make decisions anyway because of everything else that's going on and all of the different factors that are influencing it, the best thing that we can do is make sure that we're spending a lot of time to develop those things. Yeah. Because in doing that, we will develop that more trusting relationship, right. And that goes a real long way in terms of the athlete being really central to taking responsibility for their own health and performance.
Yeah, I think that I want to just reiterate those 3 points, because I think that's such an important point that you make, that the foundation of so much of, in this case, the quality or effectiveness of their rehabilitation comes down to the working alliance between the athlete and whatever sort of significant other, the physiotherapist, the coach, having that shared sense of goal commitment, right? We're on the same page in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and then that trust. And when those 3 elements are there, I mean, I guess that probably applies broadly to a lot of performance issues, right? Beyond just injury rehabilitation. But that seems like, a great platform or foundation to form the basis for other, decisions, communications. Like, you seem to be suggesting if those things are in place, then other things become much easier, I guess, or the athlete will maybe more likely give you a truthful response because they know that, you're working together. You're not at odds in terms of, or trying to impose a goal that you have on them, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It can go a long way helping people know that you've got their holistic best interests at heart as well, and it's not just something that you're trying to catch them out with almost, and those sorts of things. So absolutely.
Yeah. I like that point. Their best interests at heart. I'm Adam. You've got a ton of knowledge and experience, so I'm just going to keep picking your brain here while I've got you online. One thing I do appreciate about Zoom, it's wonderful to be here in Salt Lake, and you're in England, and to be able to have these conversations is fantastic. What are some of the uncertainties? I guess we've talked about issues of control or lack of feeling of control. Are there some common uncertainties that an injured athlete might have?
Yeah, I guess particularly in team sport athletes, there can be a lot of uncertainty around their position or their role in the team. depending on the time during the season, if it's particularly in the run up to important events, or even if an athlete's getting injured during pre-season before the season started, and those sorts of things that can really create a sense where they're not necessarily questioning their role in their team, but can become much more uncertain over what it might be in the long term. And again, those things become exacerbated if we're working with severely injured athletes, or athletes that are getting recurrent injuries. Some of the things with more professional athletes can be around contractual status and those sorts of things. If they've had a bad season with injuries, that also happens to be at the point where they might be starting to negotiate contracts or even renew contracts. So those elements of uncertainty, it can be again different for younger athletes and older athletes as well. So for example, your academy level athlete who's had some injuries during their academy setup. Anecdotally, there's a lot of suggestions there that you can get a little bit of a tag as being injury prone, which might then determine whether or not you are offered a senior contract or a new contract at the club that you're at. Whereas with older athletes, it creates the uncertainty around, am I carrying on next season or not? Is this my last season? And for some athletes, for some older athletes, particularly if they've had a lot of injuries, that can actually be a little bit of a sense of relief. It can be, actually, the injuries have given me the get out now, where I've got a reason to not carry on, and I can reflect on it from that point of view. There's some interesting kind of public examples of athletes that have been in that type of sense. So yeah, I guess probably nothing out of the ordinary there, but let's say a lot of it around position within the team, role within the team, prominence within the team, contractual status, career progression, those sorts of things. But also some of the things that you would probably say are more obvious, but not necessarily as recognised. An athlete, but it's not uncommon that an athlete will be really uncertain about whether or not this is the start of an injury journey. When I go back, am I going to get injured again?
Yeah.
When I go back, am I going to get a different injury that's related to this one? So there's lots of different things that I think we need to be aware of with different athletes, even in different sports and at different points during their career, which are probably more social or psychosocial considerations as opposed to psychological considerations that might influence how they progress through their injury journey.
Sure. Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of different factors relative to age or career stage or role within the team could influence the nature of the uncertainties that athletes have. This next question may be difficult to answer given the broad diversity of uncertainties that athletes have, or the relative nature of them. How, I guess, from a practitioner standpoint, how does one help athletes manage these uncertainties?
Okay, yeah, I guess if we take some of the common ones around, role within the team, those sorts of things, and importance to the team and etc. So we, as practitioners, and I think you've met Dale as well, that I've worked with a fair bit, and one of the things that we try to do a lot with injured athletes is work to try to help them to maintain the social side of their sport and work within the organisations to so that it almost becomes part of an injured athlete's care, that we can work within the organisation in such a way where they can maintain the social side of the sport. So looking at excuse me, adding or taking part in rehabilitation sessions and those sorts of things within the vicinity of the team, if we can do, making sure that athletes have got still a connection with the team, or even if we're talking about youth athletes now, even potentially have things like match day roles or game day roles within the team, so they are literally supporting and being productive within the team environment still. And that becomes, again, important, because by completely removing an athlete from the sporting situation, they can become, much more frustrated, get a greater sense of isolation, those sorts of things. So in terms of reducing the uncertainties, i.e. remaining involved within the sporting environment, it can help from that perspective, but it can also help to create that sense of connectedness. Yeah. Having a really strong relationship with the, kind of some really prominent people within the team, coaching staff, head coach, team manager, those sorts of things become really important as well. Because in doing that, you can facilitate some of those conversations with coaching staff, player, and even, act as a facilitator within that environment should you need to. Mm-hmm. And working with and helping them to, to work with the athlete around what some of the long-term expectations are, if it's possible to do that. And, again, even if we've got a time frame for an athlete to return from a particular injury, if we're working on a time-based approach to rehabilitation, actually working with the athlete and the coach to help to start laying out some of those expectations around what the athlete's contributions might be to the team or to the event within the lead up to that time frame, so that we can reduce then some of those team related uncertainties by helping to manage and create realistic expectations for the athlete through the rehabilitation process. Right. And it almost becomes a little bit less than of a short, sharp shock at the end of the injury process, where it's, well, actually, no, you're not playing for the next 3 games, but you'll be on the bench and be with the team, those sorts of things. Right. But also, again, asking the athlete and engaging the athlete in conversation around what they think is realistic for them moving forwards, inviting questions from them, almost adopting kind of, like learning type approaches with the athlete by using question and answer with athletes to help them to construct their own understanding of different things. And in constructing their own understanding of the experience, again, we can then start to work to reduce the uncertainty. They know more about it, they're able to understand more of the decisions, they know more about what their roles might be, and as a result of that, a lot of the frustration and the uncertainty can reduce. Yeah. Now, there are elements that are probably more difficult to manage. Again, if we talk about some of those risk modifiers, if you like. If an athlete goes to a physio or a doctor or an athlete support personnel and says, I need to play in that fixture because if I don't, I miss my season bonus, or I miss a trigger for a contract extension, or those sorts of things, that becomes much more tricky and much more difficult to manage. And I'm not necessarily sure there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. But yeah, again, I'll always go back to, I guess, enabling the athletes to appropriately challenge the suggestions that we make as well, so that they feel like they've had more of an active input into offering and sharing their opinion, as opposed to just having to take our opinion on board, so that we can I guess create more of an equal power dynamic in that as well. So we don't always have athletes that are almost just feeling subservient to us in that respect.
Right. So would it be fair to say, Adam, that in your work or practical work with athletes, that you adopt certain guiding principles that influence how you work with them, and that in some ways is equally, maybe even more important than just specific strategies that you're using to address particular kinds of uncertainties?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, for me, I always adopt a person first approach, but accepting of the fact that person will have multiple facets to their identity that kind of make up. I'm not always necessarily. I wouldn't say that I'm always necessarily performance or I don't always have a performance related focus or a sport related outcome focus, because I guess whether it's by luck or by management, more often than not by working in a person-first approach, the athlete part of that identity and the athlete's performance element of that identity tends to, not necessarily work itself out, but if we've got a healthy individual, and we've got an individual who is actively involved in their own development, is actively involved in the choices that are being made and that they make about their careers, then I think we've got people that are in a much better informed position. But they're just the principles of working with people. They're not necessarily the principles of work just unique to working with high performance athletes.
Yeah. So are those elements of what you mean by a person-centered or person-first approach?
Aspects of it, yeah, and there's lots of different things that would probably be a podcast in itself. I guess briefly summarising a lot of the different things, like I say, recognising that the person in front of you is a person first and foremost. They might be within that person an athlete, a student, a brother, a sister, a single parent, or whatever. So there's lots of different things that go towards making up that individual. And if we only ever focus on one element of that and try and separate out each of those different parts of that identity, I guess my philosophy has always been, then we're always missing out part of the picture that might influence on the work that we do in some other area. It's always, I guess, I'd like to say that I pride myself on always working in such a way where I try to get to know the people that I'm working with, get to know about them, get to know about their individual circumstances, and then start to understand more about all of the different factors that then might influence the specific context that we're working within.
Right,
so if we're working with a 14, 15, 16-year-old athlete over here in the UK, well, what are their school demands? What's their assessment calendar like? How does that fit in with their training demands? What are going to be the pinch points for them during the point of the season, the academic year, where they might naturally be experiencing, more kind of psychosocial life stress? How's that? How at those points in the year, how well are they sleeping? Those sorts of things, because all of that creates the picture that we need to be able to function well within the specific context that we're working within.
Yeah, and I mean, that's such an important point that you mentioned. I guess, often earlier or on a number of occasions, you've mentioned this distinction between a performance focus versus a well-being focused, or, I don't know if maybe person-centered approach or focus is synonymous with a well-being focus. But this idea that, injury is something that happens to a person, and that person doesn't live in a vacuum. They, experience all kinds of life-related demands, stressors, or things that any human being does, irrespective of injury. And it also sounds like talking about some of those things that are happening in the life of the athlete is important, because they can all come to bear on whatever experience the person is trying to work through, be it injury or some other challenge or issue. I think that's a really important point. You also, Adam, earlier you mentioned that older athletes or more experienced athletes that have an injury have acquired the ability to really know their body, that they've accumulated enough experience to understand maybe what's happened to them. And I thought that was a really interesting point, one I wanted to pick up on a bit. And it relates specifically to this issue of being able to distinguish certain kinds of pain. And, I guess obviously for an injured athlete, pain maybe can come in multiple forms. The physical pain of the injury, maybe their pain can be more psychological in nature. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the relevance of athletes being able to distinguish different kinds of pain, maybe more sinister pain from more benign forms of pain. yeah, in terms of, I guess, the impact that that might have on their progress in rehabilitation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess um, the common phrases I think that people will use will be around um, something just not being right. It hurts and it's not right, or it hurts, but I kind of expect that that hurts because it's a bit sore. I've injured my hamstring 17 times before, so I know what it's like when my hamstring's sore because it's injured versus when my hamstring's sore because I'm just tired.
Yeah.
So I think it's more, for me, it's usually more the types of phrases that athletes will use to describe the pain, maybe more necessarily than the type of pain, but equally so, I guess those types of conversations would be the ones that they would maybe have with, more often than not, would maybe have with the physiotherapist or sports therapist or things like that more often. And I would be a party to those conversations at time.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that is always an interesting one for me around this idea of athletes being completely pain-free. And I don't think I've ever met an experienced athlete, not even necessarily an old athlete. It might be a young athlete, but that's been around the sport in performance environments since they're 8 years old. And there are lots of occasions where just the natural part of taking part in that sport for some athletes will be a certain degree of pain or soreness or discomfort that just comes with it, or on the return to sport, it's things that they expect after injury because they can recognize those.
Mm-hmm.
But then, I guess in some ways, usually it will be related to the sharpness or the severity of the pain. That's when it doesn't necessarily feel right, again, in inverted commas, to use some of those phrases.
Yeah. So those phrases are important, I guess, in terms of, that's a way from a practitioner standpoint, I guess, to be able to gauge the athlete's perception of the kind of pain. And when they use phrases like, well, that doesn't feel right, then maybe that's, or phrases that convey a sharpness or severity, then that maybe implies that maybe the pain is more harmful. Whereas other kinds of phrases may be indicative of the athlete's awareness that the pain is maybe just more fatigue related, or that kind of thing.
And I guess the important part with it is then what follows those statements. Naturally it then becomes, well, what do you mean when you say it doesn't feel right? And then a lot of the questions around how did it happen, what are you thinking about that, what's that, and even then going down the road of what happened before it.
Yeah.
And then we can start thinking about, to your point earlier on around, is it physical pain or is it something else? And start thinking about, well, not. I don't want this to sound like almost the pain being an excuse or something that somebody just says. Although naturally there are examples of that. But if people are getting, for example, sudden onset of pain after they've just tried to do a sporting activity that they weren't able to do, is it that they think they haven't been able to do it because they've felt a pain, or is it that there is a degree of pain that's enough that stopped them from doing it? And starting to understand that process a little bit more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, is it difficult for athletes to be able to distinguish the kinds of pain they're experiencing? Or, I mean, you've alluded to the fact that I guess that comes a bit with experience.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if there's other ways in which athletes can acquire that ability to distinguish pain. And
and I think there's lots of different things that will influence those perceptions of pain. If we've got, I guess, people that are quite, I guess, overprotective would be the phrase to use. If it hurts at all, don't do it type approach. That then, the more that people hear that message and have that message reinforced, the more that any degree of pain or any degree of discomfort becomes something that's really alarming for them.
Yeah.
And we know that perception then can almost potentially increase the perception of the pain severity as well in itself.
Right.
So I think there's lots of different factors that will influence how we learn about pain or discomfort.
Yeah.
And I think that when it comes to understanding limitations of what we can do and how pain or discomfort will limit those things, that's a natural. It's another natural part of the injury education, but not only for the athlete, for the people around them as well. What is normal discomfort for somebody that's returning from a grade 3 hamstring strain, the first one that they've ever had? And again, if people that have a less of an injury experience do tend to have potentially at times more uncertainty around their levels of pain and discomfort, and more worries that are associated with that as well. Right. Because it's like anything else, the first time we do something, but it's quite natural that we've been more uncertain about it the first time.
Yeah, and I imagine that uncertainty then can maybe exacerbate the pre-existing pain, right? Or maybe lead the person to catastrophize more because they don't understand it, or it's the first time, as you say. Yeah, it's like, right. But I also thought it's really interesting, Adam, you mentioned, well, there's a cultural or environmental element. And the example you gave is if the athlete is, if they're getting communication or feedback that says, well, any sign of pain is, maybe something that you should stop or back off of. I wonder if the reverse is perhaps more common in the case of sport, right? Like,
absolutely,
the mindset of, well, you're told, okay, well, disregard the pain, or there's a lot of cliches, I guess, in sport about sort of pushing pain to the side, or working through it, right? And so I imagine that could also influence how the athlete internalizes their own pain experience as well, I would think.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think even maybe taking it a step further than that, where playing through pain in inverted commas is celebrated and congratulated, and you're almost viewed as by putting yourself through that, you become some sort of superhero to your teammates, particularly if you're doing it in and around more important events.
Yeah.
Now, again, I don't think we can ever lose sight of that pragmatic nature of performance sport. If athletes are contracted to play and those sorts of things, where I think that is almost, now it's become just a natural byproduct of that culture, where if you're ready enough and you can manage the pain, you'll play. Yeah. Then I think the important part for me is, if people are in so much pain and so much discomfort that we're kind of going towards medicated control of it to the maximum limits that we're able to legally do, and there's lots of other management approaches that are put in place that might limit different types of movement so that pain goes away, then for me, I think that's when we've got a real challenge on our hands. But I would certainly say that probably the more common culture is the one where we celebrate the playing through pain, rather than celebrate recognizing the fact that really severe pain is a sign that there might be something wrong that we need to take care of. I guess this idea of when if people are getting to the point where we're almost encouraging catastrophizing around pain, how much does that then limit the things that people will do that are designed to alleviate the pain through the natural processes of rehabilitation? More simply, oh, that's a bit sore, so I'm not going to do that again, rather than working through kind of the optimal loading principle of, okay, doing that will ultimately make that pain go away in the long run.
Yeah. So again, kind of understanding that there may be times or circumstances where rehabilitation is uncomfortable, where there are certain forms of pain, and that working through it is important. It's not necessarily a sign of injury, but a sign, I guess maybe getting swelling down is not always going to be comfortable, or getting range of motion isn't necessarily always going to be easy or painless, but that it's important in the service of other kind of goals. Whereas maybe other forms of pain, as you mentioned earlier, if it's sharp, or if athletes can describe the nature of it in their communication, and it suggests, well, maybe that's the kind of pain to back off of, then then there's benefit in doing so. But I also think your point about the culture sort of deifying or celebrating or glorifying working through pain is really, really important. And I guess I wonder if you're also suggesting some moderation of that. It may be beneficial at times as well.
Yeah, and I think we're almost getting into the point here around the discussions of, well, how much is the sport culture an injury risk factor in itself?
Yeah.
And for a lot of people who will accept that injury is just a consequence of playing performance sport. But if we then create a culture that then worsens that and increases that potential level of risk, then there'll be concerns about that. But equally so, there'll be people that will listen to this podcast and will sit and think, but that's just how sport is. That's how it is, and particularly around certain sports, that's just how it is. That's how it works.
Right.
And is that part of the problem? Is that part of the solution, or is it just what it is? That again, it's a difficult question. But I guess for me, if I'm looking at it from an idealist perspective, if there are things that we can modify within a sporting environment that will decrease the risk of injuries for our athletes, then we should be looking to do it.
Yeah, well, I would certainly concur with that sentiment. And I think this mindset that anything is just the way it is, or, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I appreciate, without being naive, in the case of high performance sport, there's a lot of demands and pressures and constraints, not just on athletes, but on different stakeholders. But of course, it's only by having discussions, by pointing some of these things out, by doing research, that we say, hey, well, maybe we can modify these things. First of all, if there's an interest or will to do so, and evidence to suggest that modification may result or change injury risk, for
Absolutely.
instance, right?
Yeah.
I've got one more question here for you, Adam, and then I'll leave you go. I really enjoy our discussion here. If you were to give one piece of advice for an injured athlete trying to make a successful recovery, however defined that is for them, what would you advocate or suggest?
Can it be part 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D?
Yeah, it's tough to pin it down.
I guess for me, so I guess it goes back to some of the core principle question earlier on. And some of the core principles for me for athletes are: get to understand your injury, understand what you can do with it, when you'll be able to do it, when you might not be, what you can't do, understand the risks, understand the benefits. Because in doing that, you then become much more in control of all the different things. Mm-hmm. Don't expect that your injury will be a linear experience just because the textbook somewhere says that you'll be back in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or whatever, and that at 7 days you'll be able to do that, and 14 days. Don't necessarily expect that will be the case, because every injury experience is individual. You might have setbacks, you might have days where you're just not on it, you don't feel it and you don't want to do it. And don't be overly concerned by those things. They're just a natural part of the process.
Yeah.
I always like using the out of 10, kind of scenario of it don't matter whether you're 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10, 5 out of 10, as long as we get 2 out of 2 or 3 out of 3 or 4 out of 4. We do the best that we can do during the process that you're in. And then that's you rehabilitating at the rate that's right for you. But the other part of it is always, seek the help where it's needed, or even better, just as a natural part of your rehabilitation, because there are lots of things that we can do around things like kind of verbal or written emotional disclosure, different elements of psychological skills training that are used with athletes, elements of goal setting, even things like introducing athletes to kind of mindfulness, app-based mindfulness approaches that they can use all the way from us, all those sorts of things. So I guess the closing point would be, don't shy away from the fact that there is a psychological element to your injury as well, and there are ways that we can work to develop that, as well as using techniques that might also potentially have certain physical or physiological benefits for you, or even potentially technical and tactical benefits for you, that are performance related, that you can do working with the right types of practitioners. Right. So that's my 1A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, I think.
Yeah, those are wonderful thoughts to finish our discussion, Adam. And again, I so much appreciate your time, and I always enjoy our conversations. So great to be with you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's been brilliant, Les. Thanks for inviting me on. And I always enjoy our chat. So I'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Sounds good.